So here's a quick overview of the severed head makeup that I created with Freakmo recently. We started out by putting Kiana's head inside the dining table, putting the plate around her neck, taking some reference photos and measurements to ensure that we made the sculpt at the right size. I cut out a paper template as a guide to make sure that we built it up to the correct height. We then used some plastic and a marker to roughly trace out the outline of the prosthetic to make sure that it fit her neck correctly. We then began to bulk out the sculpt on a tile using chiffon soft clay, always taking that plastic trace as a guide to ensure that we kept it within those lines. Once we had the outline mapped out, I began to increase the height of the sculpt using the paper profile template that we'd taken earlier. While I worked on the larger piece, Kiana worked on a smaller extension piece on the side. We never ended up using this in the final makeup, unfortunately. We continued to swap between the two sculpts, so taking it in turns working on the larger and smaller piece, adding more and more detail as we go, so fatty texture, arteries, veins, going in and refining the skin tears a bit more and adding skin texture. Once we'd finished refining the sculpts and we were happy, we began adding some flashing with more chiffon clay to get them ready for moulding. When the flashing was complete, we then got some water-based clay and built up walls around the outside of the piece. As Kiana continued to go around and seal up the clay walls, I began mixing up some pinky seal silicone. We poured it in over the top of the sculpts. Kiana went around with a brush to ensure that it got into all the details. Once the silicone had cured, we began to remove the clay walls and clean out both molds. Because the larger piece had quite a lot of detail, I needed to go in with some naphtha and a Q-tip or a cotton tip and just clean out some of the crevices. I needed to go back over and do this quite a few times. When both molds were completely clean, we gave them a layer of Vaseline and then wiped up the excess. Then we made a mixture of Super Baldies and alcohol in a 50-50 split and began painting that inside both molds using a hairdryer in between each layer. Once both molds had 3 layers of the cat plastic mixture and they were dry, we began mixing up our silicone. This has 100% deadener with flesh tone pigment and yellow and red flocking. I then began to pour the silicone into the molds in a high, thin stream to ensure that there were no air bubbles. Once we did that, we squeegeed off any of the excess. Then went around with some Q-tips to ensure that there was no silicone on our blending edges. Once the silicone had set, I dusted over both pieces lightly with some powder and then began to remove them from the molds. Unfortunately, I think we probably could have done 5 layers of the cat plastic mixture as the flashing began to tear away as I was removing them from the molds. Once I'd removed both pieces from the molds, I dusted over them again lightly with powder to ensure that they didn't stick to one another to get them ready for application. I made sure that Kiana's neck was clean by wiping over it once with some isopropyl alcohol, then putting the prosthetic down on her neck without glue to work out its positioning. Once I was happy with the position of the prosthetic, I got some Talasys 5 and began to glue the piece down. After that, I worked my way around the edges with some isopropyl alcohol, removing the flashing and blending the edges down to her skin. I then dusted over the area lightly with some powder to remove any tackiness from the glue. I then began to add some colour to the prosthetic by going in with alcohol activated paints, starting with really light washes of the rose adjuster and then gradually adding more and more detail and darker colour. I completed the colouring by adding some dark red to the skin tear and inside of the arteries, as well as some yellow to simulate fatty tissue, and then finally some black to cover her neck. When the painting was complete, we were ready to set up the final composition. Kiana got into position underneath the table and stuck her head through the hole. I put the tablecloth over the top of her and then the plate around her neck, and we began to dress the scene. So to complete this illusion, I then went in and added some blood around the neck piece, a couple of random drops in the corner of her mouth, some random splatters across her cheeks. I then went in and added a lighter cream colour to her lips to simulate blood loss, and then finally some dark tones in around her eyes with purple and dark blue. And then last of all, I went in with a damp tissue and mopped up some of the excess blood, and that's the final look. I had a really awesome time creating this piece with Freakmo, and I look forward to doing more work with her in the future. If you haven't seen her work, go and check out her channel. I'll link it in the top right corner of this video now. Thanks for watching.